What's the future of 5G networks in Australia?
And are the new crop of cheaper 5G handsets worth a glance?
Vertical Hold is proudly brought to you by Aussie Broadband, changing the game with their award-winning network and Australian-based support.
Hi there. Welcome to Vertical Hold Behind the Tech News, the weekly podcast where we gleefully, virtually jump across the state borders to catch up with Australia's leading technology journalists and get the stories behind the tech news of the week. I'm Alex Kidman, and I'm joined as usual by Adam Turner, a man who appears to have accidentally left the Vertical Hold studio door open late last week. So it appears that Chris Duckett from ZDNet has finally escaped. Adam, what were you thinking?
I'm sorry, man, I was cleaning out the freezer and he got away. Look, I want a hard target search of every gas station, residence, warehouse, farmhouse, hen house, outhouse, and doghouse in that area. We will get him back.
Well, slightly more tentatively stepping into the Vertical Hold studios as a result of that proclamation from Mr. Turner is Jennifer Dudley-Nicholson from News Corp. Now, Jen, we're deep into the end-of-year product release frenzy cycle, which means little in the way of sleep for tech journotypes. How's your stock of caffeinated gummy bears holding up?
You know what? I'm unfortunately, because I can't get to America, I've got to dig through the past. So I've been cleaning up areas of my house just to find caffeinated gum. I found a couple of packets so far. They're like gold.
Your secret stash.
Don't let
That's
your
my
kid get
very secret.
Do not let your kid get his hands on them, though.
I'll know about it if he does.
There is that. Now, this week, there's a kind of Tim Cook-shaped elephant in the corner of the virtual Vertical Hold studios because Apple's finally announced that it's holding a special event next week at which will no doubt see the first 5G iPhones. And Apple being Apple, it's not really saying very much besides that, but we're resisting the temptation for now to go into rumour frenzy, as so many are, because I feel there's a bigger story here we want to dive behind, and that's 5G. And we're not talking about the crazy conspiracy theories that your weird aunt insists are true about it spreading coronavirus. And just for the record, Aunt Lucy, you are plain incorrect on that score. Still, with Apple expected to finally join the 5G party, we thought it was time to dive into the state of play for 5G in Australia more generally. Not just the competing devices that are going to take on the Apple marketing juggernaut, but also how our telco networks are building out 5G, how they compare, what we can expect in the future, and that eternal question about whether or not 5G is really a worthwhile NBN competitor. So let's dive first into where 5G is going to head in the near future in terms of access and speeds. Now, Jen, I know you've keenly tested out lots of 5G gadgets and you've looked over what the networks are doing. But so far, for a lot of people, 5G appears to have been pretty underwhelming.
Yeah, it's a strange one because, normally a new network comes along and we're all very excited to jump on board, but 5G has been a bit different, and not just because of the weird cousins and their conspiracy theories, although that's definitely part of it, but also because sometimes when you get access to 5G, it's not all that impressive. So it really depends, where you're connected, how close you are. It's very dependent on how far you are from an actual tower this time round. As to what speed and also what the carrier is doing in order to get you that speed. So I've had some pretty lackluster 5G, and I've got to say, more recently, as some carriers have built out their networks, it's gotten a lot better, and it'll be 4 times the speed of my amazing HFC technology back from the 1990s.
So part of the challenge here, though, is so far we're only sitting, it doesn't matter which network you're with, and we'll get into, I think, the individual differences in a little while, but it doesn't matter which network you're sitting with, we're still all sitting at sub-6. Some have actually described it as like 4.5G, not really true 5G, because we don't have any millimetre wave actual live networks in Australia, do we?
We don't, but try to explain millimetre wave to people and they're just going to freak out. I really think that we need better descriptors for this sort of stuff. It was like, what is LTE versus 4G? Well, the new version of that is 5G versus millimetre wave.
Millimetre wave just sounds scary. It sounds like it's going to drill into your brain. It sets people off.
Yeah, it's not going to play well on Facebook, I've got to say.
No.
And when it was
Lucy,
described
trust
to me,
us, you'll be all right.
when it was described to me as millimeter wave, I was like, can we just call it supercharged or something? Or, I don't know, some
Next G?
Yeah.
I mean, if Telstra's not using it
extra
anymore.
5G, yes, 5G plus or something. I don't know. I feel like it needs a new moniker, and people weren't thinking of this all the way through. But actual millimeter wave technology, I'm super excited about. Should it be working in the way it's been promised to me?
The challenge there, though, of course, is that the actual spectrum hasn't been allocated. And I think the current plan that was set, I think, in a pre-coronavirus age, was that all this stuff was going to be auctioned off, I believe, early next year, which of course isn't that far away. But nobody in the telco space is saying that they're likely to have any kind of actual live network for consumers till at least mid and probably late next year. So you're going to be waiting a while, Jen.
Yeah, look, it's sad. However, we're talking about buying 5G devices now, and if I was in the market to spend, more than $1,000 on a phone, then I'd certainly be in the market to make sure that it could actually do millimeter wave and it could use that technology. Because even if we have to wait a year for it, I mean, potentially I'll be holding on to that phone for more than 2, maybe up to 3 years, depending on battery life. So it's the sort of thing that you need to be having a look into and seeing if your device will actually support it. Because it's worthwhile mentioning to people who, aren't au fait with millimeter wave technology and why it's not actually a medical device, that this is a serious speed boost. We're talking about potentially, 4 times as fast as the current generation of 5G. So it is going to make 5G, when it's up and working, actually look like an interim step to the future.
That's a good point. If you're close enough to the city centre to get decent millimeter wave coverage, because millimeter wave has a lot shorter range than normal 5G. So if you live in the inner city, then chances are that you'll be able to use that millimeter wave reasonably early in the millimeter wave rollout. But if you live in the outer burbs of, even it doesn't have to be a capital city, but one of the major regional centres, it could be a few years away. So I wouldn't necessarily, if I was buying a new phone today, I wouldn't necessarily stress too much about millimeter wave if you knew you'd get it for your next one. But like I said, it depends where you live.
It does, and it also depends on the rollout maps. Like, I'm right on the edge of 5G at the moment, for example, and so there's a case where I can probably get it in my bathroom where I don't actually need it, and can't get it in my study where I do. And I'm not that far from the city, so that's because this rollout has been so different, because 5G doesn't go as far from broadcast as far from the towers as 4G did, for example. And certainly that's going to be the case with millimeter wave again. So these things are going to take time. It's going to feel a little bit like the introduction of 3D television and which comes first, the gadgets or the actual technology, for a while. But I think that ultimately you want to be planning for the future, and I would certainly be demanding more stuff from my gadgets this year.
Well, speaking of millimeter wave, Telstra, I think, has actually been the noisiest in terms of proclamations about what it's been doing. It was granted an ACMA license to do some millimeter wave testing. It doesn't have a live consumer network, stating relatively recently that they managed to, I think it was up to 4.2 gigabits, but that was with a lot of bandwidth in a terribly, terribly controlled kind of area.
Down a mine shaft. Like falling down a mine shaft, you know what I mean? Yeah, not down a mine shaft, yeah.
But it also brings up this spectre around what these advanced speeds are going to be useful for. Jen, they often talk about this stuff as business case more than consumer case, don't they?
They do. However, I think we've proven this year in particular that everyone has a use case for getting on the phone and annoying people on Zoom. So potentially this is going to be an easier sell and an easier explainer to people when they talk about why you need high speeds, why you need a lot of bandwidth.
And I mean, competing with the likes of Telstra, you've got Optus, who, and we've kind of talked about this, and we talked about this last week when Telstra launched its own foray this way. They've more played in that 5G fixed space, but they've also got kind of mobile and millimeter wave ambitions. I guess we kind of switch across there because Vodafone's a slightly different kind of creature. We might get to that in a minute. To kind of talking around coverage, because that's one of the big key things. Jen, you've mentioned a couple of times you're not that far from the city, but you're still on the edge of 5G coverage maps, I'm guessing, with Telstra?
Yes, that's with Telstra. I haven't seen, yeah, I mean, as you mentioned, I haven't seen Vodafone really take a play at this yet. And I certainly don't qualify for Optus 5G either. It's a bit of a dead zone. And I'm talking about 4 kilometres away from the GPO, so we're not talking about the boondocks.
Yeah, the 5G coverage maps are as patchy as hell in Melbourne. And when I look across the other capital cities, it seems to be the same. It's very hit and miss once you get beyond the very inner city. But I think that's actually because they're being a bit more honest this time. I remember when 3G, when 4G first came out, and I was trying to test them at home, you couldn't trust the coverage maps because they were so vague. But when you rang the telco, the people on the other end of the line actually had more accurate maps than you, and they could say, yeah, it's not available in your street, but it's available 2 streets across. Now you can get that level of detail from their publicly available maps. You look at Telstra and Optus, and it does go down to the street level, and you can see it radiating out, particularly the way Optus has laid theirs out. You can see it radiating out from the specific towers, and you can see where it's got good coverage in one direction, where it's obviously flat, and not so good coverage in another area. So it really does look patchy. And yeah, I can totally see, looking at Melbourne, for example, living 4Ks from the CBD, you've probably maybe only got a 1 in 3 chance of still falling in one of those patches or being on the very edge of one.
I'm a good distance away from 4K from the CBD of Sydney.
Yeah.
Although, interestingly, 5G has come a lot closer to me, and they may even be being a little bit underselling some of their maps, because the closest blob to me, um, I can actually go a little bit outside it and get some 5G coverage within that space. But the devices I'm on register as 5G, and I get what I would call 5G capable speeds. Although, as we said before, they're sort of more top range 4G. I've actually had better speeds on 4G in some cases than you'll get on 5G. The coverage maps thing's kind of interesting, though, with Vodafone, because if you look at them, there's a lot of promise there, but the only coverage maps they're actually showing right now are around Parramatta and Sydney. Everywhere else, it's just little red dots of, oh yeah, we're planning to build here.
Yeah. It's interesting that when you look at the Optus maps, you can toggle between the 5G home coverage and the 5G wireless mobile coverage, and they change slightly. The range of every tower drops a bit to acknowledge the fact that you need that bit of indoor coverage and a stronger, more reliable signal. So they are being a bit more honest and straightforward, perhaps, than they've been in the past when it comes to these things.
Yeah, and it gets weird regionally. I've done some testing on this regionally. Jen, I don't know if you've been able to bounce around wherever 5G might be available in Queensland, but I've hit a couple of the regional spots that are meant to have 5G, and generally speaking, it shows up. But my own experiences of testing it is, gee, I think I'd rather be on 4G right now.
Yeah, well, it's strange. Telstra's doing a lot of testing down on the Gold Coast, and they've got a 5G sensor set up there. And you really want to be around the Gold Coast if you've got a 5G device, because it is smoking down there. And it's a fantastic.
Aunt Lucy, don't panic.
It's a hotspot, if you like. But yeah, outside in other areas, then it is quite patchy, and even in areas of the Gold Coast, around Kira, Coolangatta, those sorts of areas, I found that sometimes you get amazing speeds, and then sometimes you absolutely don't. And as you mentioned, like the variations in speeds as well, which you can't really tell until you have one of these devices and you can test it out. There is a particular mini golf course in the centre of Brisbane where I have found the finest 5G speeds. And yet, if you go just down the road to the hospital, you'll barely connect at all. So it's very location dependent in this case, and I think it's going to be a slow rollout for all of the companies, but certainly the slowest of all for the companies who aren't really that keen on it so far.
So that raises a very obvious question, Jen. Why are we not recording this podcast in the middle of mini golf? I mean, mini golf and 5G.
Missed
If they've
opportunity.
got good coffee, I'm moving there permanently.
Look, you can move here permanently, but you cannot visit. I'm sorry.
Oh, that's a good point. Can't cross the border just yet. Curses!
I live sort of more than 5, but less than 10 Ks from the city, but I get no coverage because I'm down in a valley. And that's very clear when you look at the maps. You can see how the coverage moves around the valley. But I'm not that far away from Tullamarine Airport. So when 4G first came out, it was the very CBD and Tullamarine Airport, and Tullamarine Airport was closer to me. So when I was testing handsets, I was actually driving up the Tulla in the middle of the night and sitting sort of on the side of the freeway testing phones, looking very, very dodgy, expecting to get pulled over by Border Force
There's an
one night.
ASIO file about
Yeah,
this somewhere,
exactly.
I'm sure.
What
Adam.
is this guy doing on the
Definitely on
side of the
someone's
road
list.
with all these phones looking very shifty?
Near the airport, yeah.
Near
Nothing
the
to worry
airport,
about there. Yeah, so, well, the coverage is one thing, and I guess the available bandwidth for lots of people is another. And this raises that ugly question that we have we've tackled a few times, but I guess we have to face, especially with the likes of Telstra joining in this chorus of, hey, instead of going on the NBN, you could go on fixed 5G. But is it an actual competitor? Is it something that's going to scale and work for enough people to really disrupt that NBN model?
Not yet.
How far, though?
Yeah.
Will it ever?
Well, it's interesting because the Optus offering is unlimited, and I know that they've come under fire for saying unlimited before, but I imagine that within only small parameters, you can actually download a lot on that. But with Telstra, in the past, what we've seen is they like to meter their mobile broadband, whether that's 5G or 4G or even 3G. They like to know exactly how much you're using. So all it's going to take is your Mac or your PC to all of a sudden download a very large update, and suddenly you're having an interesting conversation with the call center, pleading your way out of thousands of dollars. So it's an interesting transition for companies to go from that sort of stance to, yes, you can just sign up and use your entire household can use mobile broadband. So it's going to be interesting to see how Telstra gets over that. And I know with their 5G modem currently, you can get what is considered a pretty reasonable price for 200 gig, but a lot of homes are using more than 200 gig between all of the streaming and all of the video conferences and what have you
Games
now.
updates. If you're playing
Games
Call of Duty,
updates, we're
200
about
gig's not going to go far.
Yeah.
Well, and we're coming right into new console times, and
Yep.
so there could be some big hassles in terms of connecting those sorts of devices. But it is really interesting, this idea that you could just have a 5G connection instead of an NBN connection, and particularly in some of those regional areas where your options aren't great. If there was a 5G option, I think some people might take it up.
Regional is interesting, but I think, well, the practical reality for Australians population-wise is we live in the big cities or big regional centres. And there I think you will inevitably, though, hit that brick wall of wireless being shared spectrum. It's great if you're the only person on 5G in your area, you'll probably do quite nicely out of it. But the more people that stack on and the more people that stack on, the worse it's going to get.
Well, with 5G, one of the benefits is supposed to be, in addition to low latency, that it can actually hold more, have more capacity and hold more people on the network and deliver decent speeds. So I'm hoping that is the case, but it does become a question of whether it's worth it whether you can get enough uptake in regional towns. But maybe if there's enough people in regional centres, it could be an option. I imagine companies like Telstra are keen to look into it in areas where there is enough population to sustain it, because they're not in complete control of the NBN.
Oh, absolutely. It's not hard to see why they're pushing it, because even though the investment in 5G is incredibly expensive, they can control how much money they make out of it, whereas the margins on NBN plans, as we know from every single NBN ISP, are razor thin as it stands. I wanted to shift us on, though, to this question of devices, and we were talking a little bit earlier about getting millimeter wave devices or not getting millimeter wave devices. Part of the challenge with that, though, is actually finding that detail out. Because if you think to yourself, oh, well, I'll just go and look up the specifications, quite often the makers of mobile phones are not very good at letting you know whether or not that's actually the case in Australia.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's really annoying because we don't often talk about, so that's a phone. What's the camera like? Also, what spectrum does it use? And I do recall an interesting conversation I had once when LTE was first coming out, and we were talking about whether a particular device had 4G that would work in Australia. And I'd looked it up previously prior to the announcement, and had found out that no, it would not. And some very angry marketing people put some arguments to me and some demands for corrections, and I was correct. This is not something that you're going to see on the outside of the box, and so you will have to do some research yourself as to what it will actually connect to.
But it gets worse than that, because even if you do the research, because I've done this myself while trying to chase this up for this show, I was kind of thinking, right, we'll run through some of the ones that are dual millimeter wave and sub-6. And the problem is so many manufacturers have a specifications list which is determined by head office, and that's whether or not head office is in Cupertino, Seoul, Tokyo, wherever. That's just, here's the full list of every spec of every variant with an asterisk, network availability subject to location and local carriers or things like that, which
Or
doesn't
local
tell you.
model. Local
Yes,
model may
exactly.
vary. We sell different models in different countries, which you really need to know, because that gets back to the bad old days of, was it 3G or 4G? I think it was 4G, where
4G,
different
yep.
telcos use different bands. So if you bought a phone for Telstra, you wouldn't get the best speeds on if you moved it to Optus. But also, if you imported it from overseas, you had to know which band it worked with and which network you were going to use it with. And that was supposed to all be long behind us, but it's not.
No, we're entering a fresh level of hell.
Yes, a new circle.
What we are at least seeing, though, is a lot more affordable 5G devices, because when 5G launched last year, it was all in the flagships. It was all, look, give us $1,500 minimum and more again, please. Whereas now there's a whole raft of sub 1,000, what's usually referred to as the mid-range phones in terms of pricing out there. Jen, have any, and I've certainly tested a bunch of them, and I know you have as well, have any of those particular phones particularly stood out to you just yet that you can talk about?
Yeah, well, I mean, I was excited to see what Google has planned for their Pixel smartphones this year. I'm a little bit less excited that they're not coming out in XL varieties because I do like a big phone and I cannot lie. However, I think it's great that both the models that they have, so there's a version of their 4A phone which is coming out with 5G, plus their top range Pixel 5 will come out with 5G this year, and both of those are less than $1,000. Which I think plays to a much larger audience than, when Samsung comes out with its flagship model and says, yes, but that'll be $2,000, thanks. Not that there's anything wrong with that, because those devices do a lot more, but it's nice to see 5G filtering down to the everyman with the budget. And also, there's a couple of TCLs that I've tried that have not been shabby, especially for a mid-range device. And Oppo's done some decent stuff, and they're plugging away, and I believe that you can still access the App Store on those as opposed to side-loading things Huawei style. And so I think that 5G has become a lot more available in that way. It's worthwhile pointing out, though, that Telstra earlier this year ditched plans to add a $15 fee to access 5G, but they did kind of do a bit of a sneaky by rearranging some of their plans so that you will end up paying more in order to access 5G, because on the lower range plans, it does not include them. So you not only have to look at your handset, but then you have to look at what plan you're actually on as to whether you can access 5G with that handset, just to make life more complicated.
Yeah, it's one of the things actually Vodafone's selling its very limited 5G on, is that and it words this very carefully, it says it does not currently intend to charge extra for 5G on current plans. It's leaving the door open, but it's at least saying, hey, look, in theory, no, you won't pay more for it, which is perhaps a point of differentiation there. Jen, you brought up the Pixels there. And, well, I may as well say there's a review embargo, so I can't say too much. But I think I can safely say one of the things there to be aware of, though, is that full-fat Pixel 5, that's dual millimeter wave and sub-6, but the 4A 5G that we get in Australia is not.
That's still just under $1,000, though, for a 5G phone that is capable of both. And so, I mean, sure, this all depends on, the battery life, which there was an issue with in the last top Pixel, although they say that there's a bigger battery in this model. But that's still a pretty decent price for, a phone that should see you out for a couple of years.
And as you say, I mean, they've got competition. LG, Motorola, Oppo has 4 or 5 phones in that sub $1,000 space. And we're seeing new chipsets bounce through, which should in fact lead to even cheaper 5G phones next year. Qualcomm's just launched the Snapdragon 750G, and it's got I think it's a 400 series 5G capable modem coming next year, and that'll be your sub 500 5G phones. So this stuff's going to accelerate. Jen, how soon do you reckon we might hit a market where if you want to go out and buy a new phone, it doesn't matter. It's just going to be 5G.
It still might be a couple of years away. It depends what company you go with at the moment. So, for example, if you go with Samsung, a lot of their devices are 5G because they really sort of came out of the gates and did a deal with Telstra and made sure that they had 5G on their phones from the get-go ready to go. However, as with all things, Apple, I mean, as you mentioned, are sitting in the corner of the room waiting to launch, and they wait until things are kind of all wrapped up and we've seen sort of some of the early stumbles. I think that a lot of people will come onto 5G rather this year, just because there's an iPhone with 5G in it. And I don't think that their impact on the Australian market can be underestimated, because most phones, most handsets that are smartphones in Australia are iPhones. So I think that they will have the biggest impact, and potentially in a year's time, the majority of phones will have 5G, and potentially a year away from that, we'll be talking about a minority, like a very small minority of phones that actually offer anything under 5G. Certainly, we won't be seeing that many 3G phones kicking around anymore.
So, Jen, based on what Apple's done in the last couple of years, do you expect to see more than one iPhone from them? And do you think they'd go the whole, okay, the premium one is 5G and the cheaper ones aren't? Or do you think they'd go the whole 5G across the board based on what you've seen them do in the past?
I think that I mean, it is interesting, and they'll certainly come out with a range, is my prediction. The top model will definitely have 5G, but they made such a big deal about it in their invitation. I'd be surprised if most of what they offer doesn't have 5G. There might be like the smaller models that they're talking about that does not. But for those people who are interested in a budget iPhone, then the SE already came out earlier this year. So there's every chance that all of the iPhones we see will be 5G. This time around, just because there is already another option out there. But certainly, I think most of them will be 5G this year. And it's something that Apple's really going to back. I'm interested to see whether there are any design changes as well, which have been rumoured, because, we've seen a lot of similar iPhones ever since the iPhone sort of 10 and on. They've looked quite similar. So I'm interested to see what it looks like in addition to how much 5G it pulls in.
I think the important thing to point out here, though, is Apple, you're right. I don't disagree. Apple's going to push 5G heavily, and it's going to help push the adoption of it. But Apple is late to the party, not just because it's bided its time. It's also because it gambled on 5G and lost, because they were working with Intel to do their 5G implementation until Intel finally said, yeah, this is too hard, we can't crack it. At which point, Apple settled its lawsuit with Qualcomm just so it could get 5G on board. My gamble here, Jen, is that actually we might only see it in the premium model because Apple's had to come to that licensing agreement with Qualcomm. And I'm sure that grates on Tim Cook every day. And putting it across the range means he's got to put more money into Qualcomm's bank account.
I mean, he's got some money. I don't think the bloke is poor.
Yeah, but he doesn't like giving it out. I mean, Apple notoriously doesn't like giving the money out.
Yeah, I mean, I hope that's not the case, because I would hate to see 5G just to a certain range of phones that's going to set you back $2,600 or whatever it may be. I think that if Apple is serious about it, then they certainly should spend the extra money and push it across. And certainly from what we're hearing, potentially they're going to be taking things out of the box that comes with the iPhone this year. I don't know if that will include the plug that goes into the wall, as it did with the watch. Because there's an argument to be made. There's some safety issues with taking all the plugs away. However, I don't think that this one will come with headphones, from what the rumours have been saying. And so maybe all the money he can see saved on headphones he can put into 5Gs.
Well, that just about wraps up yet another episode of Vertical Hold. Thanks to Jen for making time for the show this week.
Thank you.
And Jen, clearly I know how to raise you on social media or read your stuff online, which I do frequently. But how do the listeners do that?
Oh, bless them. They can go to Jen Dudley on Twitter, or they can see me across all number of News Corp titles, such as the Courier Mail and the Daily Telegraph, because I cross the borders virtually.
Just virtually, though. Just virtually. You're staying with them.
Only virtually.
This is good. This is good. And of course, if you want to catch up with us, you can do so on Twitter at VerticalHoldAU, online at verticalhold.com.au, or via the Vertical Hold Facebook page.
And once again, thanks everyone for listening. Don't forget to tell your friends about us, spread the good word, and leave us a review on your podcasting platform of choice. Vertical Hold is proudly brought to you by Aussie Broadband, changing the game with their award-winning network and Australian-based support.